So hello and welcome to the attendees of Distributed SQL Summit. Thanks for joining this session, a virtual session. Everything is virtual, so the topic is even more important than ever before. Since it's virtual network telco. So telco is an interesting domain in industry in general, as we all might agree. Telecommunications industry, if you look at it like maybe 50 years ago, would have been simply telephone companies and service providers, right? It was a much simpler world back then. But today in 2020, it's kind of hard to comprehensively define or mark the boundaries of telco, right? Like this whole conference and the way today we all meet and greet and go about with our daily lives, the mobile network, internet itself, video conferencing, IoT, so many devices that stay connected, the payment network, 5G, so many things are all part of what is telco today. So there's a ton of trillions of dollars of economic activity in telco and because of telco. So fascinating, but the attendees and panelists of this conference are predominantly from software engineering, data engineering sort of a background. So we'll keep the context a lot more technical, more so in the scope, in the realm of software systems, data, etc. And wisely so, we have chosen a panel of experts from telco. So let me take a moment to first introduce myself. I'm Prasad Radhakrishnan, VP of Data Engineering at Yugabyte. So with us today, we have folks from Rakuten, Comcast, and TracFone. So I'm going to let them introduce themselves. Like, how about folks from Rakuten? You want to go first?
Yeah, this is Hale, Donertasli. I work as a cloud in Rakuten. My focus is on SDN and databases.
This is Puneet, and I'm a part of, I lead the automation initiatives around the platform development for Rakuten Mobile for both 4G and 5G implementation, primarily around the Kubernetes layer.
I'm James Taylor, and I'm involved in security with respect to DevSecOps, and then on our developer experience side with driving different tools and technologies around DevOps.
Hi, I'm Kartik. I'm a principal enterprise architect at TracFone. I'm leading the cloud strategy as well as DevSecOps strategy at TracFone. Thank you.
Great. So thanks to you all for making time. So let's get started with set of broader questions, and let's narrow down to something more specific. So let's start with what are the fundamental innovations that are happening in telco space, as how you see it, you drive or you lead those initiatives. We hear a lot about edge, IoT, 5G, etc. So what are some of the top innovations that excite you the most?
I'll go first, ladies first. 5G requires more scalable and programmable infrastructure, of course, and to make this possible in telco environment, of course, we have seen some new concepts like COPS, control plane, and user plane separation, and we can call it hardware and software decoupling as well. It provides independent evaluation of the control plane and user plane functions independently, and enables software-defined networking to deliver user plane data more efficiently. Other one is COTS, common off-the-shelf hardware can be used to build common cloud infrastructure without the need to buy vendor-specific hardware. And of course, one of the most important one is the cloud-native approach. It provides the ease of deploying the telco functions anywhere in core or edge without the need to move heavy racks attached to them. So these are the major innovations in telco.
Great.
I think specifically within the cable industry, really where a lot of our innovation is focused on is around bandwidth, right? So, we're constantly trying to innovate on basically getting that pipe, bigger and bigger and bigger so that we can handle, the load that's going to eventually come as we become more connected, from an IoT perspective and, all of the, smart devices that are proliferating today. So I would say, the cable industry as a whole is, definitely doing a lot in terms of expanding on bandwidth innovation, from that perspective. I think a second area for us is around, or just from, in general, from a telco perspective, is around personalization, of the customer experience, right? And so in order to do personalization, you need more data about the customer, and then you need some layer of abstraction with respect to like machine learning and AI that kind of help you drive and predict what are the behaviors and what are the outcomes that you think this customer is going to want to engage in. So clearly that's, the personalization of products, right? Making them more feeling like it's yours, it's tailored for you. I think that's going to be a major trend over time. And again, like I said, personalization requires data. And when you require data, you're talking about massive and massive amounts of data. And so looking at database technology and architecture and so forth, and how we distribute data, and then not only is it that we're getting into personalization, but that personalization has to be global, right? So if you happen to be on a trip, in the Bahamas somewhere, you still want to know that how you access your products and services, whether it's checking on home security and so forth, those tools and those products are still working and you're able to interact with them no matter where you are in the world. So I would say those would be a few areas of innovation that's really being driven in the telco space.
Great. Kartik?
Yeah, sure. So as you all know, telco is the most evolving industry in the economy now. Like you have seen how telco evolved from 3G to 4G to 5G. And now you're going to see more of IoT and virtual reality and artificial intelligence and all these aspects kicking in, right? So from a telco point of view, the organizations needs to be more agile than ever, because without agility, organizations stay behind in terms of technology curve, and it hurts the organization as a whole. So this is one of the main important aspects we look at from a telco industry point of view. And we also need something that provides horizontal scalability for the organization to grow and continue its business. Business continuity, often forgotten by most architects, is the most important aspect. And being resilient is one of the important aspects that we need to look at.
To talk about the 5G innovations, right? I mean, if I were to talk about what's essential with the onset of 5G is low latency, resiliency, and portability. And I mean, this is something which Hale and James also mentioned, that we are getting closer to the end user. Okay, so just to cite an example about innovations, when we talk about these edge data centers, these are not like huge data centers. These are as good as like 2 to 3 quad servers. That's it. And we are expected to run Kubernetes deployments with hardly one core, a single core, running telemetry on it, running all the management workloads. So that's the evolution which is happening. I mean, we've managed to run workloads on huge data centers, but when it goes closer to the edge, I mean, that's the key thing: portability, resiliency, and enabling the telco industry to give that low latency to the end user, and along with it, the automation aspect, which brings in the efficiency on the operations. Those are the key areas where a lot of innovation has been happening.
Makes ton of sense. I understand what the challenges there could be. You want to have your runtime, some amount of apps and data running in the edge as well, so you're able to serve your customers those 5G requirements as how, like as a layman, as how I understand. I'm not a 5G expert. It's very challenging. Moving on to okay, so there are a few factors just in general, right, in our lives that ends up a forcing function to drive change, the need for a change or innovation, right? So now with the current climate, I think this is again a broad question, but I think it's a very important and interesting question, is what kind of impact is COVID having on your business? I know it's been like the last 4 to 5 months we have been in this new kind of a climate. So how is it pushing you? What are the changes you're seeing happening in technology space that you're responsible for?
No, I think, COVID is definitely, again, back to my first point in terms of, telcos needing more and more bandwidth, right? So in essence, when you're at home and you're working from home and you're educating your kids from home and you're entertaining yourself more from home, right? When everything becomes more from home, then in essence, bandwidth requirements goes up, right? Your performance and your latency become critical, right? How you scale horizontally becomes critical. How you synchronize data across your data planes become critical. So, I think with COVID, it's tested. I would say also it's tested all the telco providers, right? To say really, like how well does your environment scale, right? How do you support peaks? Can you be resilient in terms of peak time and so forth? So it used to be you went, when people went to work, they spent 8 hours at work and their kids were gone from school. So at home, there was no real traffic going on, right?
Right.
Then we'd all come home, and then all of a sudden everybody would get home from work, kids would come home from school, and all of a sudden the workloads would start to increase, after 3 p.m. or whatever. Now it's just like it's high, you know,
It's always
longer.
on and always
Yeah,
high.
exactly. So I think, that obviously, the bandwidth is always going to be key, right? That pipe is always going to be, your first primary, concern. And I think COVID, I think the industry overall has been very successful at, being able to deal with, with the bandwidth increase. And one of the interesting things is that we have to realize that, telco now is more than, it's more of an essential service than it used to be, right? Before it was
Yep.
just, hey, you need to have your phone work so that you can do 911 calls, right? That was critical. But now it's like, no. Not only do you need to be able to, have communication, but hey, I got to be able to watch the news. I got to be able to watch my movies. If I can't watch, my favorite TV show, I'm going to lose my mind. You know what I mean? So it's become even more of an essential service. And given that everything is connected, like my whole home is connected from a security perspective, all the cameras are wireless, the support service is wireless. So I need that, right? So telco is now becoming even more of an essential service. And I think that's been a major change in terms of understanding how important telco now has become to us with respects to pandemics and other types of natural disasters.
Thanks, James. Kartik,
Yeah,
your thoughts?
great points, James. I completely agree with him on the data usage and increased usage needs from people across the globe, right? And also we are seeing a lot of digitization efforts across telco industry as well. People that haven't digitized earlier has to digitize more. We have seen an increase in online sales as well because of the social distancing practices and other things. So the plans that most telcos had or most organizations had at the start of the year had to drastically change to accommodate COVID situation. It's not just the implementation plans and deliverables, but also the entire financing plans and everything. So it's a huge change and a huge opportunity for the entire industry as well, because industry is seeing everything in a new angle today with COVID, be it work from home or be it your digitization efforts that you are doing or DocuSign efforts that you are doing. So things are going to become better post COVID, and I'm hoping for that. Thank you.
We all do. Thanks, Kartik. Puneet or Hale, do you have any thoughts to share?
I'll pass this to Puneet because he might feel the effect more than me. So
Go ahead, Puneet.
Okay, so one of the key essentials which the virtualization brought into 5G or the 4G implementation was we a year back we introduced this concept of zero touch provisioning. Okay, so when we bring up a site, I mean, what we ensured is that the entire site would come up within less than 10 minutes once the connectivity is in place. So today it's reaping us benefits of that, wherein our ops folks or our engineers, on-site engineers, don't really need to go onto the site for any build-up activities or bringing up the sites. And that's one of the key essentials what technology has given us. I mean, from the ops perspective or the management perspective, it's been a pretty I wouldn't say effortless or a convenient move, but all the prep which we have done in the past that paid off with this. On a personal note, okay, it more than a technology shift, it was a cultural shift. Okay, I
Yeah.
mean, being worked in India and in Japan, I don't think many companies out here are a big advocate of working from home. But today, I mean, it's become a new norm. I mean, we've all been working from home for like a good 4 to 5 months now. uh, we miss a lot of aspects around, whiteboarding with the team or interacting with the team. When we meet vendors, it's all happening over virtual media, and we're not connecting on a personal level. But I mean, the team is coping up with him, and we are kind of prepped on that front too.
Great. But I want to sort of, touch on one thing that you mentioned, which is reaping, you're reaping benefits today, which is the efforts that were put, for automating things, right? The automation efforts, what you're saying, that was put in place a year ago. Today, it's helping you because of this less touch or zero touch deployments of whatever that might be. It's helping you today. Is that a fair way to sort of conclude?
Precisely, Prasad, and that's the sole reason why Rakuten advocates the whole concept of laying the foundation right. I mean, when we're building the platform, when we're building all the automation around it, we are ensuring that we're not making compromises while we're building this network. So that's the sole reason we say that we won't bring up the site unless and until there is complete automation. There won't be any manual bring up until there's a complete sign off given by the automation team.
Makes ton of sense.
Yeah, and I would like to
Yeah.
just to kind of just add on to that. I think definitely from an infrastructure and a technology and a software development perspective, we've really been tested because over the last 5 years has been a lot of transition to cloud native architecture, right? Microservices, NoSQL databases. We've really been changing out our entire development lifecycle and ecosystem, and with things like Concourse and doing pipeline deployments and Kubernetes and containers, and having even high performance computing and and machine learning and AI, adding all those new things into the mix. This is the first time that they've all been seriously tested from a scale perspective, right? Because we've all been talking horizontal scaling was the way to go, smaller applications, microservices, and scale, and just roll out and deploy. And I think that's all been tested, in a lot of organizations. And I think having that agility, right, with pipelines, into what Sunit was saying with respects to being able to have zero touch deployments of platforms and systems. If you needed to open up a new site, in AWS West or whatever, you could basically press a button, start deployment and so forth, and get that up, pretty quickly. Or if you wanted to do GCP or Azure, any one of those places, you could have a new environment up, in hours versus what used to take, months, to plan. So I think this environment we're in is really testing a lot of the architectural principles that we've been espousing over the last 5 years, and a lot of the new technologies. So it's been really exciting to see a lot of that, kind of hold up, right?
Yeah, absolutely. Now, Kartik, do you have anything? I think automation, like when I worked with all of you folks, in different sort of time frame, I worked with you all. So, Kartik, from a TracFone perspective, how do you relate to automation and how that's helping during the COVID times?
So automation is a very important aspect for TracFone, and we are looking for maximum automation and possibly zero OPEX if possible, right? Like more the automation, your operational expenses would be close to zero. So this is something that we are aiming for, and we are working towards complete automation through our DevSecOps strategy, as James mentioned, be it AWS or be it a cloud native strategy using Kubernetes orchestration and other things. So we're working across all fronts, not just from a implementation architecture point of view for our transactional systems, also on the data side, as well as our business side and operations side and finance side as well.
Awesome. Great. Okay, so now I want to touch on apps, right? And then segue into data. So now everyone is trying to become cloud native, right? And cloud native could mean a lot of things. I'm not going to poke at that, but I'll say I love cloud native. I think I should have printed in my T-shirt, distribute the loud, distribute cloud native. But what's happening in your space or org? So, and I'll make this a two-part question. Like between, let's say, legacy application and modernization efforts, which we know that all the enterprises are doing, some kind of, modernization effort. And then there's another category, which is the new next generational applications. So A versus B, right? Would you agree that broadly your time resources are split between these two categories for the most part? And which one you think is more needy in the sense that you spend more time on one versus the other? And an extension to that question, can you talk about what's the impact of those initiatives? What's the impact on your network and the database layer because of it?
Yeah, I agree with you. Cloud native is a big umbrella which covers a lot of things. My perspective is actually this umbrella is not a trend, it is a must. If you miss it, you can end up melting with acid rains because everybody is following this. You can't be out of it. We are so used to welcoming major new technologies almost every year in Rakuten, previously in Google. That's why new technology should be always backward compatible at high scale with the previous technologies. For example, going back to your question, for networking, considering 5G, going for full cloud native, and at the same time, we need to coexist with LTE. So in general, to roll out 5G successfully requires more than just upgrading the RAN network. From a telco perspective, being cloud native is one of the key enablers of 5G, and software-defined networking enables the demands of all these workloads. So the effect on networking is basically decoupling the control plane and the forwarding plane, and similar approaches on apps too, decoupling the data and compute. And
Right.
speaking of data, the impact on the database layer is a little bit different than the other layers. So I see almost an opposite impact. What I mean by that, other layers such as networking are going through the massive partitioning. On the other hand, the database layer is becoming more unified. Others are partitioning and database is more unified. It is actually easy to explain this from CAP theorem perspective. For many of you already know, CAP means that you can only deliver two of the three categories, which is consistency, availability, and partitioning. Since we are already going through the massive partitioning in other layers, to be able to deliver 5G requirements, we need to keep the database is more unified. So these are the effects I see on the database layer.
Great. And I would think like what you're describing, is very relevant to some of the next generational applications, more so from the whole 5G initiatives that is putting, like new way of thinking. I wouldn't put it as a burden, but sort of a new way of thinking with regards to network and the database layer.
Yes.
Yeah. Thanks, Ali. Puneet, do you want to pile anything on top?
Yeah, just further to what Hale mentioned. I mean, when we are building this platform, right? I mean, for Rakuten, a Kubernetes-based platform, we are having a wide variety of applications. Okay, I mean, you mentioned it as monoliths and more matured applications, but it's more essential that the platform or the layer which is more oriented towards the cloud native technologies acts as that gating criteria or the gatekeeper to maintain the sanity of this platform. So that's something that's the challenge, or that's the key area where we are investing time, where we understand not all apps are ready with their a cloud native roadmap, but we are giving them an opportunity. We are giving them guidelines. We're laying out basic principles in terms of what is expected out of them and how they can take this journey with us and partner and make the best out of the platform which we're offering.
From a cloud native point of view, TracFone as an organization is going through a transformation implementation across the board for all our transaction systems. And we are moving away from monolithic implementations like many other organizations towards more horizontally scalable implementations. And as Hale mentioned, that database has been one of the primary concerns because As implementation solutions and transaction systems are getting more distributed, database is getting more monolithic in nature going forward. That's one of the main concerns that needs to be addressed. And also, in regards to the modernization effort, TracFone is innovating a lot of internal tooling to automate their release management capabilities, CI/CD capabilities, DevSecOps capabilities through self-service and high agility. So this is something TracFone is working internally, and we are planning to release some of these tools that we're developing in-house as open source as well. That's something we are planning forward for that.
I think when you always talk legacy, right? It's always a loaded term, right? Because you always have the one side of the fence of people says, "Hey, look, this app, we've had it for 20 years, and look at it. That COBOL app on the mainframe been running. I don't have to do anything, all that fancy stuff. It just works," right? And you hear that, right? And then you have the situations where people say, "Oh, well, look over here at this legacy app. We run it through Sonar and Sonar Cube, and it calculates, hey, there's 365 days worth of technical debt in that application," right? And that gives you some indication of the quality of that app. So you say, well, hold up, if we wanted to refactor this app or make changes to this app, it obviously takes a while, right? And so when we start rethinking the whole notion of decoupling functionality, it becomes important to understand how does that map to some of your business strategies. And what I mean by that is, to give you an example, we were one of the early adopters of Cloud Foundry and the Spring framework, and we had a platform that basically supports activation of our products. Well, not only does this app support activation of our highest revenue generating products, but it also supports activation of lower revenue products. So, well, if it crashed because of a bug in the lower generating revenue products, it in essence crashes everybody, right? So that was one of the first apps we targeted for kind of migrating to a cloud native, because the first cut is like cutting a diamond, right? The first cut is your most important cut when it comes to decoupling, the code, right? And so we basically first started breaking it out based on the products, because we wanted to say, hey, these products generate the most of our revenue. We don't want them to be impacted by code that supports, our products that generate the least amount of revenue. So that was like an easy, right, decision as to how do you make the cut. You make the cut based on product functionality, right? And then you kind of go on from there. And so that was one of the, as part of the journeys we took and some of the analysis we were making around how do we go about slicing a monolith so that we can optimize the overall business and so forth from a resiliency perspective. And so, yeah, I mean, I've, led a team and we basically, went and cut and decoupled apps, across the board, broke them into microservices, used Spring Boot framework, to then repackage them and so forth. And then at the same time, we looked at the whole data plane, right? And so then we started thinking about, okay, data services. Well, now we got to look at, how we do distributed microservices, but saying, okay, well, but we can't distribute the database, right? Because of what we're running. And so we had to come and look at, well, how do we address that concern? And so for a while, we haven't been able to address that. And so obviously with some initiatives we have, with your organization and so forth, we're trying to look now, how can we get closer to having not only the functionality distributed, but the data distributed in a way that's more resilient and more flexible and so forth. So.
Great. That's actually a very valuable insight that folks who are trying to come out of monolith, the analogy that you gave, the first cut in a diamond is the most important one. So I think that's a valuable insight for anyone trying to come out of monolithic to microservice journey. Thanks.
I want to add one more thing to this discussion. Thanks, James,
Sure.
for bringing the challenges of distributed systems, as in like what we're going through. Another challenge that we're looking at from an organization point of view is the mindset of development teams and existing organization. Today, most people who have worked on monolithic architecture, they tend to go monolithic even if you give them a distributed architecture and a containerized solution. They try to put everything together in one place and try to deploy that solution. It's not necessarily bad, but to add more resiliency, as James has mentioned, the mindset has to change across the organization as well. The design to survive failure at each and every point has to be embedded into the implementation architecture and design. That's one of the challenge we are addressing, and we are handling that through some design workshops, as well as measuring their design maturity from an agile standpoint of view.
Makes
Yeah,
sense. Ton of
that's a
sense.
very good, and that's a very good point. I mean, I think the really, when you look at cloud native, one of the fundamental principles you should grasp from that is that failure is going to happen. So instead of trying to invest in preventing failure, you want to invest in being able to recover from failure, right? Or prevent failure. So having that kind of distributed nature, with respect to, and I would say the data in the database is probably like the last frontier that we haven't been able to really successfully, get to that point. And I think what's coming around today, tools like Yugabytes and so forth are now trying to kind of attack that kind of, I wouldn't call it the last mile, because it's probably like the data is like the most important because it's critical to so many other things. But that's probably where we're trying to get to now, is to really start looking at an organization that says, okay, we're good on the application, the functionality of software architecture. What about the data? Because there's so many things that come with that, right? In terms of how you shard that data, how you distribute that data, and so forth. And so,
Yeah,
so I think
no,
that's
well
really
said.
cool.
Thanks. So in a cloud, moving on. So cloud, and I have some familiarity with you all and what you're trying to accomplish in this space. So I know that cloud is super important to you. So one could simplify it to a basic form, and say cloud is just infrastructure, but we know that's inaccurate, right? So what is cloud to you? And is Kubernetes an important part of your cloud strategy, and why?
Okay. I mean, it's always hard to put a definition. I mean, everyone's been trying to put a definition around cloud, and everyone comes up with their own definition. Some tag it around infrastructure and the virtualization layer. But what we've experienced and what we've noticed is, okay, infrastructure, virtualization, very essential, non-negotiable. But what actually adds value is the services which you build on top of it. When we are talking about services, I'm not talking the applications which are going to be onboarded, but how do you make the life of a developer really comfortable? How do I let him focus on the functions which he's building, rather than how he's going to deploy it, how the availability of it would be maintained. Those should be the least of the concerns for a developer. And that's what is cloud for Rakuten. I mean, when we talk to application developers, right, we have an ecosystem of around, say, 70 odd group companies with 200 plus applications. And when they want to get onboarded into this platform, we want to offer them all these services out of the box, so that they're focused on the function development and not on
Sure.
how do you want to maintain the resiliency and stuff around that. And coming to the Kubernetes aspect of it, okay, Kubernetes has really added value in terms of driving how this resiliency and operational, the time which we're spending on the operations and the automation which we're building around it. It has really added value in terms of on those lines, and the healing and the capability which Kubernetes is bringing in around scalability and elasticity, and that's the key which a platform is able to offer to the application developers.
That's a good question that you proposed there in terms of cloud. It's for me it's a lot of things, and I think it depends on where you come from, in terms of, if you're a startup, right?
Yeah.
The cloud is like, that's your moneymaker, right? Because that's your quick way of getting in, getting built. You didn't have to, hire a ton of engineers. And, the old way, you basically just went to a service and just said, hey, spin me up this, give me access to your managed service this, your managed service this, your managed service that, right? And again, going back to developer experience, you couldn't ask for anything more, right? To a certain extent, right? But as you get as a large organization where you have your own data centers and you have tens of millions of dollars invested in data centers and resources and compute environment, then you're not going there for compute, memory, and storage, right? You're going there more for, hey, what services do you have to help me accelerate the delivery of my application? So you look at it as more of supporting your application architecture, right? Whether it be messaging capabilities, whether it be API gateway capabilities and so forth. You look at it for how does it support my application architecture, right?
Mm-hmm.
That's like a decision you would make if you're a larger organization. But then you also want to say, well, you want to be multi-cloud. And so then you have to say, well, now I got to use things that are in that public cloud or in that cloud space that I know is available across clouds, right? So if you use, say, Yugabyte in AWS, you want to know that Yugabyte is also available in GCP and it's available in Azure. So you can pick between those cloud providers who has a location nearest to your business globally, right? So you can use all three, but you don't want to necessarily do something that's limiting you. So from that perspective, there's just a lot of different ways of looking at cloud, right? Now, in terms of Kubernetes, again, we're about developer experience. And
Yep.
I would say, over the last 5 years, Cloud Foundry has been hands down the platform for driving developer experience. And then I would even throw another gauntlet down and say the Spring framework, the Spring ecosystem is another environment that makes developers' lives easy, right? And are two great technology platforms that really support, support developer experience. So when you look at Kubernetes, Kubernetes comes into play from the perspective of helping to drive and support other use cases, right?
Mm-hmm.
So specifically, when we try to live in Cloud Foundry from an ephemeral perspective, if you need persistence and you need that more intensive layer of data integration, then Kubernetes becomes supportive of those use cases where you need data storage and persistence and things of that nature, and other types of network control plane as it relates to Istio, Envoy, how you separate that abstractions and so forth. So those are some things, from a Kubernetes perspective, what you want to look at, but there's more you got to do with Kubernetes, right? I mean, I deal with it, every day, as well as with Cloud Foundry every day. And so I know the difference between how much I've got to do in terms of from the CLI with Kubernetes versus from a CLI number of steps I've got to take from Cloud Foundry.
Kartik, you have thoughts to share on this?
Yeah. Thank you, guys. Thanks. Great views on cloud and Kubernetes. From me, the way I look at cloud is an implementation framework for infra that provides you highest level of agility to deploy your infrastructure, resiliency, maintain the compliance, and also provide the scalability needs you guys need. So this is for me, cloud is a great aspect from a architecture perspective as well as business perspective to help you be agile. Now, thanks to AWS for spurring innovation on cloud aspect. Kubernetes is great because it's very highly portable, as Puneet has mentioned. So today we have Kubernetes clusters deployed on our data centers, and we are planning to migrate to AWS, and it will help the migration make easier from a Kubernetes point of view. Not just that, if you look at cloud, public cloud is becoming more and more segmented when it comes to implementation practice. And that's going to impact developer experience, as James has mentioned, to a large extent. Kubernetes is helping in standardizing that developer experience as well. Like the same framework that you could leverage for multiple things. You don't have to use different kind of cloud products as well. So this is my highlight.
Got it. Got it. Makes sense. Thanks. Now, I think, between what Puneet shared and some of the, thoughts that, James, you mentioned about where you're looking to leverage Kubernetes, I think the common thread for me, was that if, for stateful applications, especially, right, Kubernetes, is sort of providing the kind of, support, so there can be better automation that one could aspire to do with Kubernetes, right? So I want to sort of double click on that. I mean, and get your thoughts on, how do you see this sort of panning out? Like, there's a lot of investment from our end, Yugabyte, to run not just a simple a database cluster on Kubernetes, but also take it to the next level of having a multi-region, multi-AZ awareness, all the equivalent with Kubernetes as the runtime, and all the automation for day two efforts. So there's quite a bit of investment from our end. So I want to get your perspectives on where you see this going, and what kind of problems you think this can solve in a better way than what we had before in terms of running the stateful database like workloads on Kubernetes.
I think when you look at Kubernetes, and again, I want to just quickly kind of just distinguish between, as I was saying before, with respects to Cloud Foundry. So Cloud Foundry is an abstraction, right? It's an abstraction in the sense that from a developer perspective, you only care about small commands, CF push, my app is deployed. I don't care where it is. I don't care where it runs. It's running, right? From a developer, that's all you care about, right? Now, so therefore, underneath Cloud Foundry, obviously can be Kubernetes as the container orchestration platform, right? And I think that's what, VMware with the whole Tanzu and so forth, and their acquisition of Pivotal is doing, right? Is partly doing as well. But in terms of looking at Kubernetes, as we said, in terms of being able to do stateful things, being able to do kind of batch job type processes, and then, are really critical and some of the things that Kubernetes brings in from a consistency perspective. But the key, I think one of the key things in there is the observability, right? Mm-hmm. So the observability gives Kubernetes that ability to monitor those containers and everything, and get a sense that, hey, this is down, let me respin up another container because that one crashed with respect to your service. Or as it relates to the networking capabilities of how it does load balancing and provides you that load balancing services, capabilities across its control plane. So I think from that perspective, the fact that it's extremely distributed, the fact that it has the observability to monitor itself and restart crash containers and things of that nature, and the fact that it has this kind of abstraction and control plane with respects to network routing and so forth, I think give it this really cool, operating infrastructure platform by which you can migrate across public cloud environments and have that consistency and have that standard. And then if you run something like Yugabytes on top of it, then you get the value of some of the things that it does in terms of maintaining a consistent configuration, right? It helps to control configuration drift. And that was one of the problems we used to have back in the day when we were running, things like WebLogic managed servers, right? Is all of a sudden those property files started getting drifts across data centers, and then you're just having these outages that are just kind of self-inflicting. So having control, configuration control, having observability, I think, are some of the key things and values that Kubernetes have. And plus having some degree of an opinionation as to how you configure it, how you manage it and so forth, I think has added a lot of value. So running databases on top of it, I think is a really good use case for the platform. And I think that's one of the areas that it excels, I think, bar none.
I'll just touch upon the aspect. Primarily, Prasad has already started speaking the telco language. So it's primarily around the day-to operations or the management of life cycle, which Kubernetes is adding the value into. Like how we're carrying out upgrades of databases, how we used to scale databases previously in the virtualized environments or even in bare metal. The scalability aspects which Kubernetes has brought in, or the flexibility which it is giving us in terms of running graceful upgrades and bringing in that automation which is able to manage the life cycle with very little or no impact to the end user. And that's the key value add which Kubernetes has been bringing into the table for the database ecosystem along with the applications.
Yeah, I would agree. That's a good point. Very good point.
Got it. So that's a great point, because that is also sort of, almost half answered my, sort of the next question I wanted to bring, which was, the scaling challenges, in general, like with this, I mean, the digitization efforts and the current climate and 5G and more devices connecting. So like all these contribute to the compelling need, to scale, right? Like all the layers of your stack should be able to scale, and more so. And I mean, the problem is actually harder with stateful because there's data here, there's substance, right? It's not stateless. So it's a lot harder for the stateful layer to just, to be able to scale. Scaling takes time, right? So I want to get your thoughts on, how do you see this? Like, as we, move along with, all these new things happening over the next year or two, how big you think, just the scaling challenges, right? And any thoughts, and, how do you plan to address it more so on the stateful layer?
I have some ideas about it. From the experiences, now software engineers are too excited making microservices a lot granular, but 100 pieces is not any better than 10 pieces. So as I mentioned, it comes with this hidden cost. So and for the high scale, it is actually really difficult to test it, to see if it is going to scale that much. Of course, there are some methodologies how to reflect that into a test bed, but of course it comes with the testing challenges. And from the stateless perspective, I think there is this formula: stateless plus stateful equals to stateful. So if you have 70% of your software apps is like stateless and 30% of stateful, you can consider the whole system as stateful. So protecting the data point, it is very important that to be on the same page with everybody and making everything stateless.
Yeah, scaling has always been a challenge for any stateful layer, right? Be it our legacy applications or new applications, even on the microservices side. But from our implementation point of view, the way we are looking at things, we want microservices to be completely stateless in nature, but at the same time, we need a data layer that provides the isolation, resiliency, and as well as scaling aspects of the database. So this is what we are focusing on, and at the same time, we have to look at other operational aspects as well on the database layer, as well as stateful sets. So for every time we kick off a new project, we need a new environment, or we need to clone environments, we need to synchronize applications, we need to do data fixes. There are a lot of things that comes from an operational aspect, and implementing multiple stateful sets often results in hidden complexity. Like Hale has mentioned, having a simple solution that's operationally efficient as well as providing highest level of resiliency is something that would be in the best interest for the organization to implement a cleaner, a simple, and highly resilient architecture.
Yeah, I think it's, I think, the one thing that, as I look at Kubernetes, I think in terms of when you're leveraging the persistent volume, with respect to Kubernetes, I think the separation of the data plane and the kind of database service itself, I think is really going to be what's going to be critical, because what you want to get to, right, and where we are and we're kind of getting better at is being able to say, hey, that database request response API. So in other words, the database server is actually now a request API, because the data itself is network, right? It's network data. So therefore it means that you can connect to it from anywhere. And as long as you have, say, like on the data tier, you could have your stuff stored in Flash, and you could use, say, a technique called erasure coding, right? Which basically kind of gives you, similar to the old, I won't say old fashioned, but similar to Hadoop's 3-block writes, right? We have those, the 3 copies. You can have erasure coding, which basically is at a lower level copying the data and giving you that data redundancy, while at the same time, the database servers, they can go up and down and be distributed, and you can deploy as many as you want globally and still have that SQL query interface to it, right? You could go down, bring up another instance, because all they're doing is, for the most part, handling the request, and they're doing coordination, right? The data is static in the sense that it's sitting in a managed network provisioned storage environment, and then all you want is to be able to have access to it from anywhere in the world, right? So I think from that perspective, the issue is just really scaling the request response, but the data would be kind of more localized or more distributed in a separate way. So that's what I'm interested in looking at in terms of, as we try to build data architectures behind our applications, is to really look at, is there some abstractions or some separations we need to look at so that we can make it so that if you're trying to handle request responses for data, that request will always be handled in extreme low latency. And if you crash that node, another node spins back up, it just reattaches to the volume, right? It reattaches back to the network provision data store, and it continues to work, and it's, it goes from there. So those are things that I'm looking at, and as we continue our work, with respects to analyzing Yugabytes and using Yugabytes for various use cases, those are things that we try to look at, is to get a sense of that scale and how we're going to design that scaling architecture.
Great. No, thanks. Actually, that's a very valuable perspective that you shared with regards to how you see the separation between, so in some sense, the storage, the compute, and network, and how in a cloud environment, how these things come together. That's a valuable perspective. So now, I think what I did gather from some of the views that you folks have shared, it wouldn't be unfair if I put it this way, right? That between the future state of app dev as one, A, and B, which is future state of data in cloud, it seems like the app side of the story is figured out for the most part, at least among the panelists that I have here today, right? It seems like, at least what you're doing or what you want to do, and there's some clear, vision and solutions to the challenges. But the data side of the story, we all have some awareness around what the challenges are and where the solutions could be, but it does seem that is less figured out than the app side of the story. Would you folks agree? Right, and I also want to get your thoughts on how do you see distributed SQL as a notion, as a concept, the architecture, and what we are trying to do. How does that come together in trying to solve your challenges of today and tomorrow?
Yeah, I can go first, and it is actually mandatory for 5G because in the past Gs, like 3G, 4G, all services were delivered from the core, and all of them had the same latency, let's say 50 milliseconds. But in 5G, there are services like ultra reliable low latency and communication where the requirement is less than 1 millisecond. And therefore, we need to move the core network functions closer to the user now. So in 5G, the network functions are distributed across edge, core, far edge data centers, depending on the service requirements. So again, going back to your LLC service, may be located in the far edge, while the other services like broadband, voice services may be located at edge or core, so different areas. So this put forward the requirement for a distributed SQL actually, instead of all queries going to a central location with the attached delay. For example, for a mission critical IoT use case, using V2X, the core is at edge, while for voice call, it is at the core DC. So for having all these different functionalities within the network slice in different places of the network, this distributed SQL is really mandatory to be able to handle without the delay.
Great, thanks.
Not a subject matter expert in this, but I'll start off from the point where we started off, where having a simple active standby setup of the database was also good enough. And then we moved into an era where, okay, we're talking active. So I wouldn't say that, the app dev, the data side of the world has been behind in the journey. The community has been working pretty well move from the ideology. And today we're talking three-way replicated, geo-replicated databases. So there is a lot of traction in the community, and I mean that's where we want to tap into and figure out. I mean, help the partners grow and figure out how they can solve these problems for the ecosystem, and that's where we are very closely working with many ecosystem partners on this layer.
Yeah, I would say the thing, that I had been concerned with for years, when we started our cloud native journey back in 2014, was the whole notion of saying, hey, there's not really any cloud native databases out there. Like, because I'm like, it's like we're trying to retrofit, especially when we started going to VMs, right?
Yeah.
Because I ended up having to do a migration, so I had to go from physical to VMs, and they said, hey, guess what? We got containers now. Oh, cool. Okay, VMs contain, and it's like I took the applications along that path, but I couldn't bring the databases, right? So that was weird to say, well, okay, well, a modern, it's like having a car that looks like a Ferrari in the front and a Honda in the back,
That
it's
is
like,
nice too.
I
Don't
knew
say
someone was going to
bad
say
about my
that.
car.
That
I
was
like Honda.
that was my first car. I knew I was going to get in trouble for saying that. but
It's a
no,
great car.
yes, it is. I agree. I agree. But I think, the notion of trying to, as we talk about, the whole notion of modern architecture and modern systems. So clearly, the notion of the design patterns that we have for distributed applications kind of apply as well to, to databases. I mean, they in essence do the same thing. They take requests, give a response, they act on data, right, and so forth. So it was only natural to look at how do you do that from a database perspective? But then you have this whole notion of asset compliance, which most applications that you build don't. So that makes it tricky and hard to say, well, how do I distribute something where I need to be able to do two-phase commit, right? And so forth. So once you know that you can solve that problem, and then you turn around and you look at it from a data perspective, and you said, okay, well, how do I get this data so that if a customer calls in the call center and they're routed in the call center A, and they're talking to an agent, and then their call drops, and then they call back, and for some reason they get routed to call center B, how likely am I going to know that their data, the updates that the call center agent did in A, is going to be reflective over in B when they call in B, right? Because you don't want that call center agent to say, oh, well, I don't have a record of your stuff, let me recreate it, because then again, you have data inconsistency. So looking at how do we get to that point where the database systems and the data can move and migrate and have this kind of availability and resiliency that you have at the application tier, has been something that I've been been thinking about. And especially as we evaluate, because, I'm in part of constant evaluations of tons and tons of different database solutions. And so we're always trying to go through these criteria and evaluation and say, look, we don't want active, we don't want active passive. So we want something that basically is literally just always on. And I think that's where we are in terms of trying to look at how we go about our data and database strategy. Because the other layer that comes on that's really heavily that we're involved in is security, right? So now you've got scale is a high priority, you got security is a high priority, right? And you still have to deal with latency and response times and things of that nature, right? So I think from my perspective, looking at the industry and looking at, the direction that Yugabyte is going in, I think that's where there's some excitement to see that, yeah, we're finally getting a database that's kind of built from the ground up to be cloud native and leveraging parts of, one of the most rock solid database platforms of Postgres, right, that are out there. And I think those two combinations combined, I think are, definitely a great opportunity for companies to start kind of bringing that data and the database management component along with the distributed natures of their applications that they're building today. So that's what I think, in terms of where we're still going. There's still work to do, but that's the direction we're moving in. I mean, apparently, Yugabyte has kind of a lead in that direction, but I'm looking forward to seeing things develop more in that space, and pretty exciting.
Thanks, James.
So I agree with everyone. There has been a lot of innovation on the app development side, but very little on the database side. And we have seen distributed database evolve a lot in the last few years. But a good distributed database with strong consistency is something that we have been lacking for a long time. And thanks to Yugabyte for going that route and implementing a distributed database with strong consistency. This actually helps the microservices architecture a lot, and putting the bar up when it comes to that architecture of strong consistency and a distributed in nature is something that I hope will spur more innovation in the industry going forward, right? That's something we're looking for. And when it comes to SQL and Postgres, for example, Postgres is a great database API because it supports both SQL and also NoSQL through JSONB data type.
Yep.
And if you look at most of the organizations in the industry, they have a lot of talent in SQL, be it development. For example, in our organization, all our developers know SQL, all our business analysts know SQL, and majority of our business users also are familiar with SQL. So leveraging an existing framework for developing a distributed database architecture is something very beneficial for the organization to adopt. The adoption would be a lot easier and seamless. And the migration effort, when you look at from migrating a monolith implementation to a distributed SQL-based implementation, it will be a lot easier when it comes to migration, because you can migrate the schemas and follow some ANSI SQL standards and get the migration done a lot easier.
So this has been wonderful to get your perspectives on some of the topics that are very important to a lot of folks in technology today, and especially coming from individuals who I consider fighting the fight on a daily basis to sort of break the status quo and move your mission critical systems and the newer initiatives, driving new initiatives in your respective organizations. So thanks again to James, Hale, Puneet, and Kartik for your time and sharing your views with us.